All right, let's talk about one of the biggest questions out there. I mean, the biggest. Where did life itself come from? It's a question that sits at the very edge of what we know. Today, we're going to dig into a really interesting paper by Fatih Özgökman that takes this head on. It really gets you thinking about evolution, the limits of science, and, well, everything else. So, let's dive in.
You know, we hear about evolution all the time. It's this incredible, powerful theory that explains the amazing variety of life we see all around us. But there's a catch. Evolution explains how life changes, but it doesn't explain how it started. It needs a living thing to begin with. So that's the real mystery, right? How do you get life from non-life? Where did that very first spark come from?
Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down, following the paper's argument. We'll start by looking at what evolution doesn't answer. Then we'll check out the big ideas scientists have had, like the famous primordial soup. After that, we'll dive into some alternatives, clay, RNA, and then we get to the real mind-bender, something called the information paradox. Finally, we'll see what conclusions we can draw from all this.
All right, section 1. This is super important. The paper makes a huge point that before we go any further, we have to define our terms. We need to draw a really clear line between two different questions that often get mixed up. And here it is, side by side. On one hand, you've got the theory of evolution. Think of it as explaining how a tiny sapling can grow into a massive, branching tree with all sorts of different leaves. But it doesn't explain where the first seed came from. That's the other question, the origin of life, or abiogenesis. That's all about figuring out how you get that very first seed from just dirt and water, two totally separate problems.
And you know who agreed with this? Charles Darwin himself. It's right there in his own letters. He basically said, look, thinking about the origin of life right now is, well, he called it mere rubbish. He was saying that's not my department. I'm focused on how species change and adapt once they're already here. Coming from the father of evolution, that's a really powerful distinction that the paper highlights. Okay, so if Darwin's theory isn't about the start of life, then what scientific ideas are? This brings us to the first major attempt to explain it, the famous primordial soup hypothesis. Let's see what was cooking. So picture this. We're going back to the very early Earth. It's a wild place, volcanoes everywhere, a weird atmosphere, and constant lightning storms. The idea, put forward by Oparin and Haldane in the 1920s, was that all this energy, from lightning, from the sun, was zapping simple chemicals and turning them into more complex ones. These would then rain down into the oceans, creating this warm, organic broth, a prebiotic soup, where eventually the first bits of life could just bubble up. Now, for decades, this was just a cool idea. But then, in 1953, everything changed. Two scientists, Miller and Urey, decided to actually test it. They built this crazy glass apparatus, basically a tiny self-contained early Earth. They had a little ocean of water, a mix of gases for the atmosphere, and they shot sparks through it to act as lightning. And after just a week, the water turned this dark red color. And when they analyzed it, they found amino acids, the literal building blocks of proteins, forming all by themselves. It was incredible. It felt like they had cracked the code. But, science never stands still. Over time, as we learned more about geology and the early Earth, some problems with the experiment started to pop up. For one, it looks like Miller and Urey used the wrong recipe for the atmosphere. The real early atmosphere was probably very different. Plus, and this is a big one, they got some amino acids, sure, but that's like making a few random letters. It's a long way from writing a whole book, which is what a complex protein is like. So while it was a groundbreaking experiment, it wasn't the final answer everyone had hoped for. So if the primordial soup wasn't the whole story, where did science go next? Well, researchers started exploring some other pretty creative ideas. This is where we get into some fascinating alternatives, moving from the soup to clay and RNA. Okay, two big competing ideas here. First, the clay theory. This one suggests that maybe life didn't start in a watery soup, but on a solid surface. Think of the repeating crystal structure of clay acting like a template or a scaffold, helping the first organic molecules line up in just the right way. Then you have the RNA world hypothesis, which is a huge one. It tackles the old what came first, the chicken or the egg problem. See, DNA holds the instructions, but proteins do the work. You need both. But RNA can do both jobs. It can store information and it can act like an enzyme to get things done. So maybe, just maybe, life started with RNA. But as the paper points out, neither of these is a slam dunk. The clay theory sounds cool, but there's really no solid experimental proof that it could work the way it's supposed to. And the RNA world, it's a beautiful idea, but it has its own massive hurdle. Making the building blocks of RNA, especially a sugar called ribose, in any kind of plausible early Earth scenario, has proven to be incredibly difficult. So you might solve one chicken and egg problem, but you create another. Where did the RNA come from? And this is where the paper really shifts gears. We've been talking about chemistry, getting the right molecules. But now we're moving to a totally different kind of problem, and it might be the biggest one of all. It's called the information paradox. This is about more than just ingredients. It's about the recipe. So to really get this, we have to talk about something called Shannon information. Don't let the name scare you. It's actually a pretty simple idea. Imagine you spill a box of alphabet soup on the floor. That's just a random mess of letters, right? There's no information there. But if you arrange those same letters to spell out a sentence from Shakespeare, suddenly you have information. It's not about the letters themselves, it's about their specific functional arrangement. That's what DNA is. It's not just a chemical soup. It's a highly specific code, a blueprint. So just how unlikely is it to get that Shakespeare sentence by just randomly sloshing chemicals around? Well, the paper brings up a calculation from none other than Francis Crick, the guy who co-discovered DNA. The probability of getting just one average-sized functional protein by chance, it's about 1 in 10 to the power of 260. I mean, that's a 1 with 260 zeros after it. To put that in perspective, there are only about 10 to the 80 atoms in the entire known universe. The number is so big, it's functionally zero. It basically means it can't happen by chance. And this mind-boggling number is what led Crick to make a pretty shocking statement. He said, the origin of life seems to be almost a miracle. Think about that. This isn't some fringe thinker. This is one of the most important biologists of the 20th century. He understood that the problem wasn't the chemistry. It was the information. It wasn't about making letters. It was about writing the book. And pure chance just doesn't seem to be a good enough author. Okay, so after laying all this out, the limits of evolution, the problems with the chemical theories, this massive information paradox, where does that leave us? This is the final section, where the paper steps back and looks at the big picture and the profound conclusions we might be forced to consider. So we come full circle. Natural selection is an amazing process for optimizing something that already works. It explains the survival of the fittest, absolutely, but it has nothing to say about the arrival of the first. You need a self-replicating system before selection can even start to, well, select. As one famous biologist said, talking about natural selection before life existed is a contradiction in terms. It just doesn't make sense. This leaves us with a few potential paths forward, according to the paper. Option 1 is divine creation, the idea that life was created by a supernatural intelligence. Now, the paper notes this is, by definition, outside the realm of what science can test. Option 2 is to just say, we don't know, to be intellectually honest and admit that currently science does not have a working explanation for the origin of life. And there's a third option presented, to see this gap not as a failure of science, but as a clue, to view the persistent mystery and the information problem as pointing towards the possibility of a creator, a valid philosophical step to take. And so that's the final takeaway. We're left with this enormous, lingering question. If science, with all its power, can't yet account for the origin of biological information, the code at the very foundation of life, then where does that leave the whole conversation? It's a question that pushes beyond the lab and forces us to think about who we are and how we all got here. A lot to think about.